From the late 1960s until 1998, a period of Irish history has become known, perhaps euphemistically, as the Troubles. It involved sectarian violence between Loyalists, Unionists, and the British Army, often along religious divides between Catholics and Protestants. It centred on the rule of Northern Ireland, whether it ought to join the Republic of Ireland or remain under the control of the United Kingdom. The violence largely centred around how Northern Ireland was to be governed, fear around oppression by the other, and the actions of the British Army to stop the violence, sometimes through brutal methods. In today's video, we will cover the timeline of the Troubles, its causes, and how it was ultimately brought to an end. It is perhaps helpful to describe how Ireland became divided between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Ireland had historically been a Catholic country, subjected to the control of the British throne. In order to increase control, King James I sought to ensure Irish loyalty to him and not the Pope. British and Scottish Protestant settlers were sent to the north of Ireland to help establish James's rule over Ireland. These settlers had more rights than the majority of the Catholic population, who were not able to own land nor practice their religion freely. During the 1860s, the Home Rule movement sought to build upon a number of reforms to allow for Irish self-governance while remaining part of the United Kingdom. This, however, was not accepted by the British government, nor by those Protestants in the north who saw themselves as British and not Irish. In 1912, the Ulster Covenant was signed by around 500,000 people in the north, which sought to prevent the British government giving any level of home rule. The Covenant stated that those men who signed it would be prepared in using, quote, all means which may be found necessary to defeat the present conspiracy to set up a Home Rule Parliament in Ireland. In essence, this could result in civil war if any such self-governance were to come into effect. The Covenant also led to the formation of the Ulster Volunteers Force, a paramilitary group. This in turn led to the formation of the Irish Volunteers, who were prepared to fight for such home rule. During the First World War, some members of the Irish Volunteers launched what is known as the Easter Rising in 1916, an attempt to obtain Irish independence through force while the British were occupied somewhere else. The self-proclaimed republic would only last 5 days, being brutally crushed by the British Army. Its leadership was summarily executed, with thousands sent to internment camps. Whilst a failure, the harsh treatment galvanised support for the separatist Irish Republican Army, Sinn Féin. In the 1918 elections, Sinn Féin won 47% of the vote and became the largest party in the Irish Parliament. Following this success, the Republicans sought to form their own state, with the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, being formed to fight against the British forces. In the north of Ireland, the Catholic minority that lived there largely supported Irish independence. In response to the IRA actions, a Protestant Ulster Special Constabulary as well as Loyalist paramilitaries were formed. What followed was a series of retaliatory attacks between the Loyalist Protestants and the Republican Catholics. In 1921, Ireland was divided between the Republic of Ireland in the south and Northern Ireland, which was to remain under British control but with its own devolved government. Even after the treaty that divided Ireland in two, there was still a divide between those members of the IRA who opposed the treaty and the new Irish provisional government. This led to civil war, fighting for whether the treaty should be accepted. This perhaps best emphasises that there was rarely a case of two united sides to the conflict. Internal conflict and disagreement within the umbrella factions was common, so too was new group splintering. Whilst the IRA lost the Civil War, a remnant did remain in Northern Ireland. There it remained committed to the unification of Ireland, through violent means if needed. To combat this threat, the Northern Irish government passed the Special Powers Act of 1922. This allowed for a range of powers to the police in how suspected IRA and nationalists could be treated, including internment and corporal punishment. In order to limit the potential of another Sinn Féin majority as seen in the 1918 election, constituency boundaries were redrawn and proportional representation removed, ensuring that Ulster and Protestant politicians remained in power. For the next few decades, there were sporadic, if unpopular, outbreaks of violence, which only led to greater mistrust between the Protestant and Catholics of Northern Ireland. It became ever more normal that Catholics and Protestants in Ireland were segregated. They would attend different schools, frequent different pubs, and have nothing to do with the other side. Whilst everyone in the United Kingdom could vote, only those who owned property or rented could vote in Northern Ireland, which disproportionately affected Catholics. Often, housing and employment opportunities favoured Protestants. This treatment led to a movement to address the inequality faced by Catholics in Northern Ireland, largely based on the American civil rights movement. Any such protests were heavily policed and ultimately banned. When the protests went ahead anyway, there were often violent clashes, where Royal Ulster Constabulary, known as the RUC, would attack the protesters to prevent such agitation. On New Year's Day 1969, nationalists sought to recreate their own march on Selma. The route was to go from Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland, to Derry, largely seen as a hotbed for inequality. Derry had a nationalist, Catholic majority, but due to gerrymandering and discriminatory laws against Catholics, the city was under Unionist Protestant control in the local council. The route was planned to go through Loyalist Protestant areas, but there was a risk of provocation and violence. The RUC escorted marches to the outskirts of Derry, reaching Burntollett Bridge on the 4th of January 1969. Some 300 Ulster Loyalists met the marchers, seemingly unconcerned about the police presence. In fact, many of those who were present were off-duty auxiliary members of the RUC. Those protecting the marchers put on their riot gear, as if expecting violence. The RUC did not act, as the armed loyalists charged the marchers. But the event largely seen as the start of the Troubles occurred in August of 1969, where a similar march organised by loyalists took place in Derry. The march was to commemorate a Protestant victory over Catholics and would become known as the Battle of Bogside. As Protestant members of the Apprentice Boys fraternity marched past the Catholic area of Bogside, all manner of projectiles were lobbed between the Protestants and the Catholics. Soon, violence escalated, with the RUC stepping in to stop the rioters. Barricades were soon erected to block off the Catholic streets from the RUC and Loyalist marchers. The rioting lasted days, with the RUC encouraging Protestant marchers to engage in violence. Water cannons, tear gas, and armoured cars were all used to beat the Catholics, many of whom were associated with the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, or the NICRA. The violence was only ended with intervention from Great Britain. Some 400 soldiers of the 1st Battalion, the Prince of Wales' own regiment of Yorkshire, were deployed on the streets of Derry to act as a peacekeeping force. The troops' neutral approach appeared to be appreciated by both sides of the barricade, but the violence would not be contained to Bogside. The NICRA called for more protests, and soon enough, violence started to spread to Belfast, Dungannon, and Newry. In particular, the RUC and its bases were targeted. In response, Loyalists took to burning down Catholic homes and businesses, whilst the RUC deployed armoured cars with machine guns. The first known to have died was a Protestant named Herbert Roy. He was killed when Republicans opened fire on police and a Loyalist mob entering the Catholic Davis Street area. Clashes between the IRA and the RUC escalated, to the point where a 9-year-old boy was killed when the RUC fired their mounted machine guns into a block of flats. Patrick Rooney bears the awful epitaph of the first child to be killed in the Troubles, but he would not be the last. Around this time, the IRA split into two main factions, the Provisional and the Official IRA. One key difference was that the Official IRA was Marxist, though both pushed for the removal of British influence and a united Ireland. Both, however, believed themselves to be the true IRA, not recognising the legitimacy of one another. Whilst the Provisional IRA wanted to wage guerrilla conflict against the British Army and the RUC, the Official IRA sought to wage a defensive. Whilst the IRA fought on the streets, its political counterpart, Sinn Féin, sought to achieve the same goals through the legislature. Whilst the British Army attempted to present itself as an impartial arbiter of peace, a bias soon started to form against the nationalists. In July of 1970, the British Army engaged in a search for IRA weapons in the Falls district of Belfast. A number of soldiers were attacked with stones and petrol bombs, resulting in a curfew being placed upon around 3,000 homes for 36 hours. During the operation, 4 civilians were killed by the British Army, 78 people were injured, and 337 were arrested. 18 soldiers were wounded, but many official IRA weapons were confiscated. In August of 1971, the British Army launched Operation Demetrius, where it would in turn suspected IRA members. The idea for the operation came from a suggestion by the Unionist Northern Irish government, who wanted to remove the IRA threat. Whilst there were a number of Ulster Loyalist paramilitaries who were also carrying out attacks against Catholics and Irish nationalists, their threat was played down, and so were not targeted by the internment process. This only added to the feeling of the British Army being biased against the Catholics. In December of 1971, a bar frequented by Catholic nationalists was bombed by the Ulster Volunteer Force. This bombing killed 15 and injured 17, but sparked a series of bombings in retaliation. The following year would become one of the bloodiest of the Troubles as a result. It would also be the year in which perhaps the most infamous act of the Troubles took place, Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday, otherwise known as the Bogside Massacre, took place on the 30th of January 1972. It began as a peaceful march by some 10 to 15,000 people, organised by the NICRA, though such a protest was not legal. The goal of the march was to oppose the internment policy of many without trial. The protesters were blocked by British troops from reaching their target of the city centre. When confronted with British paratroopers manning barricades, some of the demonstrators began throwing stones and other projectiles. The British troops responded by firing rubber bullets, CS gas, and water cannons. Soldiers were spotted occupying the 3rd floor of a building, and they too were pelted with stones. It is thought that these paratroopers were the first to open fire, though this remains contentious, some insisting that armed protesters were the first to shoot. What followed were orders sent to the paratroopers to arrest as many rioters as possible. Many were pursued by army vehicles, and some knocked down. Rubber bullets were fired at close range, and the protesters were struck with the butts of rifles, as excessive force was used to end the violence. At one point, the troopers opened fire on a group of rioters throwing stones, killing 6. Some were gunned down as they attempted to flee into a nearby car park. In all, 26 people were shot and 14 were killed. Much of the reporting and most eyewitnesses stated that the soldiers had fired into an unarmed crowd and targeted those who were fleeing. No weapons were located amongst the protesters, despite initial claims that the soldiers only shot at those who were throwing bombs, a claim made by the British Foreign Secretary, Reginald Maulding. From this point on, many Catholics lost faith that the British Army was acting as a neutral force in Northern Ireland. Support for the IRA and Sinn Féin only grew, in particular for the Provisional IRA, as the official IRA was more focused on Marxist rather than nationalistic goals. The IRA therefore began in earnest its campaign against the British in Northern Ireland. It is estimated that the IRA carried out around 1,300 bombings in 1972 alone, killing 100 British soldiers but also killing and wounding many civilians. This is perhaps best shown in the bombing of the headquarters of the 16th Parachute Brigade in Aldershot, in retaliation for Bloody Sunday. The bombing was done by the official IRA and killed 7 people, 1 Catholic chaplain and 6 civilian workers. Bloody Sunday was also used by the IRA as justification for its own killings of British soldiers. The notable example being the Warren Point Massacre, where the IRA ambushed a paratrooper convoy. Bombs were detonated, destroying the last lorry in the convoy, instantly killing 6 soldiers. This was followed up by rifle fire from IRA members who were hidden in a forest nearby. The IRA had studied the British response to such attacks and accurately predicted where they would set up a response base, and so they planted a bomb. This bomb was detonated around 30 minutes after the first kill, killing another 12 soldiers. On the same day, the IRA killed Lord Mountbatten using a remote detonated bomb. This led to the infamous refrain that referenced the bombings and Bloody Sunday, 13 gone and not forgotten, we got 18 and Mountbatten. Despite the violence, there were attempts to reach some sort of peaceful resolution, as well as agreed ceasefires. One of the first meaningful attempts at peace was the Sunningdale Agreement. The goal was to allow for real power sharing between Loyalists and Nationalists, as well as creating a unified Irish council that would encourage collaboration between Ireland and Northern Ireland. By allowing for greater political representation, it was hoped that support for the IRA would dwindle. The Nationalist Social Democratic and Labour Party and Loyalist Ulster Unionist Party were set to form a joint shared power government. But many from the Ulster Party were against the process, fearing undue influence from the Republic of Ireland, afraid it was one step closer to a unified Ireland. The party voted narrowly against the process and set about staging a general strike, which shut off electricity and water supplies. The British government were unwilling to use force to break the strikes, and so the deal fell apart. The 1970s continued along much the same vein, where sectarian violence became the norm. Often civilians were caught in the crossfire, though attempting to adapt to a new way of life. Mistrust between the Protestant and Catholics only grew, fearing the other may be part of a violent paramilitary. One particular example of the level of distrust that existed can be seen in what is known as the Disappeared. 17 people were abducted, killed, and their bodies were secretly buried by the IRA. In some cases, those killed were done as part of an internal disciplinary process. There was always a real fear and paranoia that some of the members had turned informant. This played a part in the disappearances, but in some cases, no reason was ever given. Even to this day, there are a number of bodies that have not been recovered. The notion that one could not trust people, when combined with the constant threat of violence, was something that became normalized during the Troubles. As can be seen in the assassination of Lord Mountbatten, the nationalist forces sought to bring the violence over to Great Britain as to fulfill their aims. Often the targets included government and military buildings, though not always. Pubs and clubs frequented by members of the military, shopping centres and stations were all targets for bombings carried out by the IRA. In some instances, the IRA would notify the authorities that a bomb would be detonated to allow for evacuations, but not always. In many cases, the police were still killed in the blasts. But perhaps the most infamous of the bombings was the attempted assassination of the then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and members of her government in 1984. The Grand Hotel in Brighton was to host the Conservative Party conference, and so the bomb was planted ahead of Thatcher's arrival. When the bomb was detonated, dozens of Conservative politicians and family members were injured. 5 were killed, but the Prime Minister and her cabinet ministers survived. Thatcher gave her conference speech and was widely praised to her resolve in the face of such an attack. As a result, her popularity increased, though not amongst certain working-class communities affected by the ongoing miners' strike, some of whom would have preferred if the IRA had succeeded. The bomber, Patrick McGee, would later justify the bombing by stating that he sought to shatter the notion that the British government could remain safe when its troops were killing people in Northern Ireland, whilst also showing the reach of the IRA and that they were not merely criminals, and instead were political dissidents. One key contention about those captured or arrested as suspected IRA members was how they were tried and treated. In 1976, IRA members were denied their previously obtained special category status as prisoners of war, and instead were to be treated as common criminals, not political prisoners. In response, the IRA prisoners refused to wear prison uniforms, instead only wearing their blankets whilst engaging in a dirty protest. This involved the prisoners not washing whilst smearing feces all over the walls of their cell. When this received little attention, the protesters escalated to a hunger strike, at first in 1980, starting with 7 men, to match the 7 men who signed the Easter Rising Declaration. By 1981, the strike was intensified, with ever more prisoners joining in. Public support rose, with a number of demonstrations taking part. The strikers made it clear it was a hunger strike until death, or the special category was reinstated. One of the hunger strikers, Bobby Sands, was even elected to the British Parliament during the strike. Even with this and international attention, the Thatcher government regarded Sands as choosing to take his own life. When Sands died 66 days into his strike, the news was met with riots and demonstrations. 100,000 people lined the streets for his funeral as he was buried with IRA military honours. The British government remained firm in its position, resulting in the strike coming to an end with 10 dead. Even though the goals were not met, support for the nationalist movement and Sinn Féin only grew. Seeing Sands' electoral success, Sinn Féin pushed against the narrative that there was no popular support for the nationalist movement. In 1983, Gerry Adams, the president of the Sinn Féin party, was elected to the British Parliament, furthering the legitimacy of not only the nationalist cause, but also for the IRA-aligned Sinn Féin. Despite the deep divides, steps to peace were always pushed for, whether this was a temporary ceasefire or steps to a lasting peace. One of the first key steps was to come to an accord between the two main nationalist parties, the Social Democratic and Labour Party and Sinn Féin. On the 15th of December 1993, John Major's government issued the Downing Street Declaration. It stated that Northern Ireland would only ever join the Republic of Ireland if a majority of people were in favour of the unification. It established the principle of consent, stating that it is for both the Irish and Northern Irish only to decide on matters that affect them, reaffirming the principle of self-determination. Perhaps crucially, it allowed for paramilitary-aligned political parties, such as Sinn Féin, to take part in the negotiations. Shortly after this declaration in August of 1994, the IRA agreed to ceasefire. In October, a number of key Loyalist paramilitaries agreed to a ceasefire. But by February of 1996, the peace was shattered when the Provisional IRA bombed part of the London dockside, reasoning that Sinn Féin was not permitted to be involved in such peace talks until the IRA had decommissioned all of its weapons. 2 people were killed and 40 were injured. But this did not stop the peace process, with the Irish and British governments establishing what were known as the Mitchell Principles, named after the US Senator George Mitchell, who played a key role in the peace process. This included working through democratic and peaceful means to bring an end to the conflict, complete disarmament of the paramilitaries, and that violence is not used to suppress the peace process. Sinn Féin did agree to these terms, though not all supported this, some choosing to resign from the party. All the while, public support was hugely in favour of the cross-party talks between the nationalist and loyalist parties. Despite the odd outburst of violence and occasional banning of certain parties as a consequence of such violence, the negotiations continued. This culminated in the Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement, signed on the 10th of April 1998. It was agreed by most of the major Northern Irish political parties, whilst on an international level agreed by the British and Irish governments. 3 key strands were established, being 1. The status and system of government of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. 2. The relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. 3. The relationship between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom. This agreement acknowledged that most people in Northern Ireland wished to remain part of the United Kingdom, but that a large proportion wished for a united Ireland. Whilst both positions were not possible, it was recognised that such positions were legitimate. If the Northern Irish wished to join the Republic of Ireland, both the UK and Ireland were bound by the agreement to accept the will of the people. It established a devolved Northern Irish legislature and a power-sharing executive, allowing both Catholic and Protestant representation. The agreement also set about how the paramilitary groups were to be disarmed, as well as the withdrawal of British troops to more normal levels. As for those who had been arrested and imprisoned for their actions during the Troubles, early releases were arranged for those groups who had agreed to the ceasefire, and on the condition it was not broken. The agreement was passed by both Ireland and Northern Ireland with a referendum, with 94 and 71% voting in favour. It is important to mention just how similar the Good Friday and Sunningdale agreements are, though one key difference is the lack of self-determination in the Sunningdale agreement. As you might have imagined, after decades of violence, mistrust and segregation, peace was not achieved overnight. One example can be seen in the Omagh bombing in August of 1998, carried out by the Rail IRA. The Rail IRA was a splinter group who rejected the ceasefire and sought to continue the armed fight for a united Ireland. In perhaps one of the most airiest photos ever taken, we can see the Red Vauxhall car bomb. Only moments after this photograph was taken, the bomb was detonated. 29 people were killed, including the photographer, and 200 were injured. This particular event deserves a video of its own, as failures brought about by a lack of trust could have contributed to the event not being prevented. But nevertheless, such violence was widely condemned by a wary public, long fed up and instead looking to a future of peace. The peace process also allowed for examination in how the Troubles escalated, one key aspect being potential collusion between the Ulster and British Army forces. Whilst initially regarded by many Catholics as a welcome neutral party, certain actions that the British Army engaged in eroded this position. Reports that became available in 2004 from the 1970s show that the British were well aware that some soldiers of the British Army Ulster Defence Regiment were members of the Loyalist paramilitaries. In addition, a number of Loyalist informants were granted immunity by the British Special Branch so long as they avoided capture. It must be pointed out that such collusion was not exclusive to the British and Ulster forces. Members of the Republic of Ireland Garda also provided tip-offs to the IRA members. One notable example can be seen in the assassination of RUC Chief Superintendent Harry Breen, only possible through leaks as to his location provided by the Garda. Between 1969 and 1999, around 3,500 people died as a result of political violence in Northern Ireland. Distrust between Catholics and Protestants, between British and Irish, led to much suffering. In 2007, Reverend Ian Paisley was sworn in as Northern Ireland's First Minister, with Martin McGuinness as his deputy. Ian Paisley was seen as the face of the hardline opposition to any Republican or Catholic civil rights movement, and Martin McGuinness was a leading commander in the IRA. Both spent time behind bars due to their positions and actions, yet these two were able to work together and form a government. The Troubles will remain one of the most extreme examples of sectarian violence, whilst also proving a hopeful example of what can be achieved. Peace is not something that is easily reached and is not always guaranteed. Echoes remain of the sectarian violence, and with the withdrawal of Britain from the European Union, adhering to the Good Friday Agreement became a key part of the agreement. But what can be learned from the Troubles and subsequent peace agreement is vital if we are to understand what needs to be done to put an end to other political or religious fractures. What might seem impossible right now just might be possible in the future.